So today at Access Lunchtime, we have Tom van Stiphout. Tom has been a Access, or now it's Office Apps and Services MVP since about 2008, I believe. And he is the Software Development Manager of Kinetic IT, and I may not have said that correct. And Tom, you're going to talk today about changing object names. So go ahead, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Maria. Yeah, thank you for the invite. This is a topic that has had my interest for a long time. I like things done, using a certain naming convention. And in this case, I wrote some code to, change Northwind, just as an example, to the naming convention that I like. Other people might disagree, but I like when objects don't have spaces in them and don't have any other funny characters like slashes or ampersands. This just makes code easier to read, I think, and also easier to write because you don't have to use square brackets as much or underscores as control names that have two names would sometimes be put together by Access with underscores. All of that is not really needed anymore. And if you just use that camelCase, like we're going from first name, first space name to first name without a space, it just makes a lot easier, I think. And we're not just doing that for the table names, we're doing that for the fields, we're doing that for everything that we can find in the Northwind application in this case. And it so turns out that we can find it in a lot of different places. It is indeed not just renaming the tables. And so I want to high level talk about kind of my strategy of doing it. So I have a function, a subroutine called apply naming convention. And it goes in and does the work. And we'll be looking at the code shortly. I'm setting a couple of options. One of them is actually name autocorrect. You'd be surprised that it is actually slightly beneficial in this particular case. We are then also creating the log table that name autocorrect would use. It would create its own if we let it, but that one doesn't have a primary key and doesn't allow us to search easily on the old value field. And you'll see later that we're actually going to be using that information to make some of our conversions. And then we're going to do two passes. We're first going to rename the top level objects, I would call them, the tables, the queries, the forms, reports, modules, and macros. Just rename their names. Of course, that breaks a lot of stuff. So we then need a second pass where we step into those objects and do more. And if we step into the tables, then of course we see the fields there. And so we need to go fix up the fields, the field names, take out spaces. But we also need to do things like there might be a row source property set for a field that is a combo box. So there might be a select first name from TBL users. What is it? Employees in Northwind. And so we want to be able to fix that up as well. Macros, there's a lot of macros in Northwind, and even if you don't use macros very much, like most professional developers really don't, there are sometimes a few. And so I went into fixing up the macros. Fixing the SQL text. Here is where you will see that name autocorrect does some of the work for you and some of the work we still have to do ourselves.
Right.
We also will have to fix up the VBA behind, both in the modules. We've just renamed the modules, right? But now we step into the modules and fix up the VBA. And then we loop over the forms collection and do a number of things there as well. I will point out a little bit later something about the labels, that we have to save them and put them back later. We will have to fix up all the embedded macros that Northwind uses fairly liberally. control names, control properties, the code behind the forms, restore the labels, do the same thing for the reports, and done. So that's my overall strategy, and I want to show you the end result first, or actually the code running, so that you can see where we're going with this, and then we'll step into the code to see how to do that in a little bit more detail. So this is Northwind as downloaded a couple of weeks ago, and I've added 5 modules, and that's all that I've added. These mod, DAO, etc. It's kind of my naming convention. So I've got some string functions, and then mod this application. That is where the main application code would be, including that apply naming convention I was talking about. And just increase the font a little bit for people who might not be able to see that so easily. All right. So let me organize that a little bit side by side so you can see kind of the flickering going on. And let's just run this code. And so what you will see is that we're doing that first pass that I was talking about, where we're renaming all the objects, and then we're going to step into the objects and do more. And this will run for about 60 seconds. Access may go to not responding. Sometimes you see some flickering, sometimes you see like form design, so you know that forms are being opened. I'm outputting a bit of information to the immediate window, just letting it do its thing for now. When the properties window is open, it runs a little slower, so sometimes you get lucky and you can close that while it's open for just a brief moment.
Does all your status stuff just go to the immediate window, or were you putting it somewhere else?
Yeah, I'll point it out in a moment. For the most part, everything is written to that name autocorrect log table. So here we are at about 90% or so of processing, and we actually take an error. You enter the control name, customer name, which is already in use. You can also see that we don't have debug available. That happens sometimes when you write code that modifies code, especially on the VBA side of things. You may not always be able to get in break mode. If there was a breakpoint, you may not be able to hit it. You will get a message that basically allows you to either end or continue and ignore that breakpoint. Sometimes you get lucky with breakpoints. In this case, no. So we're going to click end, and we're going to take a look at what happened. This is an imperfection of the invoice report in Northwind, where we have a bill to customer name, and that name has already been corrected to customer no space name. And we have another field for the also called customer name. And this one is also about to be corrected to customer no space name. So that is the imperfection. In Northwind itself, it's not a problem because one has a space and the other one doesn't. But in our case, neither one is going to have a space. And so we have to make a small correction here. And I'm just going to call it customer 2. That's the only error of this kind in Northwind. And I just want to go to design view and make sure that this is off. Control F4 to close that. And let's run this code one more time, F5. It will run faster now because it has already done some of the work. There is some here and there's code that says if there's nothing to do, then don't do it.
Did that clear your log when you started over again?
It actually did not. That's
Okay.
probably a good idea. I was looking at that in preparation for this meeting. In hindsight, yeah, that's probably what I should have done. I don't think in this particular case it causes any.
Yeah, I don't know, Tom. If you're logging like each change you're making, the
I
second
haven't.
pass, you're not making those changes. So I would expect to see both logs myself, but then I haven't looked at your logs, but.
Right. I know that there is a situation where I'm doing a lookup into the log, and I believe I'm doing a DLOOKUP, which would find the first entry that matches the criteria. So even if there were two rows that were identical, it doesn't hurt anything. Okay, so now we are here at the bottom of the code. We are done. And so now we want to take a look at some of the code and how we actually, sorry. One more thing. So now we want to try to run the code, but before we do that, we want to compile it. And here we see a few imperfections. So I think I got to about 97% if I had to put a number on it. This is one of those examples where that object was called product space ID, that control. And it's now called product ID. And I haven't found a good way yet to fix that. So this is one of those things where we can programmatically do 97% and there's 3% left to do. So I'm going to fix the couple of occurrences of that particular scenario just by compiling it and finding the 5 or 6 places in the Northwind code where this happens. Of course, I've given some thought of how can I do this programmatically. I don't have an excellent answer for you yet. Oh, sorry. Let's do this one a little bit differently because there's a few of these. So let's just do a find and replace of all of them. Replace all. There's 3 of them. And one more, I believe. Okay, now we have a clean compile. So now we could actually restart the application. And we can log in. And to the instant user, it looks the same. We can do the same things that we could do before. Buy some elements. Create the purchase order, sure. All of this works exactly the same way as before. Then look at our employees, etc. Of course, what has changed is that all these object names now no longer have spaces, so that's really great. There's one more little gotcha. Let's go into that here. If you go to the sales report and you just want to preview that, you'll get an error. The report name, yearly sales report, is misspelled or refers to something that doesn't exist. And so there's a little bit more code to wrap up. This is again part of that 3% that still has to be done manually. So here the name of the report is just in a string, and one would have to probably do a little bit more work than I think is feasible so easily without having a real VBA parser to be able to fix this up. There's a companion element to this where in the sales reports there are SQL statements, in one of the fields of one of the tables. That's a bit much for me to go assume that that is the case and fix it up, because of course this is completely custom to the particular application. This is not really part of Access. This is part of the application, and you can't. That goes a little bit further than I was willing to take it. It's no big deal to take out a few spaces here, so that we can then turn around and run that report again. I made one more mistake. In that same table, there was a column about what is the field that you are sorting by, or grouping by. So that is now product no space ID, employee no space ID, etc. We were doing the product report. So if we do that again, and it runs fine. So that's really more fixing up something that's at the application level. Let's look at the code and see. I just want to pick out a few things that are of the most interest, probably. So I mentioned that the log table is a little bit different. I've added a couple of fields. I really hate tables without a primary key. So this is also one of the very few objects that still has its old name. No, the spaces were not taken out, because otherwise Access would not be able to find it and use it. So some of the entries in this table are from Access, and some of them, most of them are from me. I added the ID column primary key, and I added this old value 255, so that I, unlike this existing field, that is a memo field, in this one I can sort and search more easily. And then we have, going back to this situation here, where we're saying in the first pass, we are just going to fix up the names of the tables and whatnot. So the way you do that is you cannot really loop over the table devs collection. That might be your first instinct, because as you're renaming objects, the collection, they will be sorted differently potentially, and so you might miss things. And so just like when you're deleting from a collection, things get reshuffled. What you want to do is just grab an array of all the objects, and then doing that using this custom function, and then loop over the array. So, and then what I'm doing is for each of the, in this case, table names, I'm going to call one of the two functions that we will see called, and this one's called toConvention, which is as simple as one would hope. Is that what I noticed is Northwind has forward slashes in some of the object names. Let's replace them with underscores. That is, for example, for your country/region field. Let's skip over the next one, and then here we're just taking out spaces. So very simple, just make a few, the least amount of changes, but that basically gives us the object name that we want. And then of course you just assign the name property to that new value, and I write to the log file the fact that I just changed something from an old value to a new value. And then it's just rinse and repeat for the queries, forms. We're not going to step into that, the macros, everything else. So at the bottom of doing that, we're starting our second pass now. We're going to do some things that are a little bit more interesting, such as opening the form in design view. So this is where, okay, so part of this is where Access name autocorrect is on, right? And as part of that, it does some things that we really like, and it does some things that we really hate. One of the things we really hate is that if you have a label with a caption first space name that is connected to a text box bound to a field called first name, right? And you change the one, Access also changes the caption property of the associated label. So we don't want that, of course. We want the human readable first space name to be the caption. And so that is not an option that you can turn off. I still want name autocorrect for other reasons. So what I decided to do was I'm just going to save all the labels to that same log table, all the captions, and then later on I'm going to put them back. So that's what we're doing here. Here we are fixing up the field names, very similar to what we've already seen. And we're also fixing up the row source. So we're saying for each field in our table design, if it has a row source property, then go fix that up. Now this is a SQL statement, so I have a special function that can change a SQL statement to the convention that we want. So a little bit different syntax, the SQL language versus a VBA expression or an Access expression. And so we have to do a little bit more work. We have to find the open square bracket and the close square bracket, and then fix what is inside. We have to be careful that we don't mess up temp vars. Of course, I didn't initially write this code. I then found out that, oh, it's also fixing up temp vars, because temp vars can potentially be of this form. I would never write them that way, but they can exist, and I believe do exist in Northwind. So leave them alone, and then everything else we're now within the square bracket, and we can take out spaces so that if we have a first space name within square brackets, it's now first name. Square brackets remain. So that is how we fix up a row source property and other properties that are SQL-like in a moment. I'm not going to step into this, but this is one of those examples where tables can have validation rules, and validation rules are also SQL statements. Maybe not with first name, but first name greater than Fred. These kinds of expressions need to be fixed up. I want to stop on macros for a moment and step in here. So we've already renamed the macros, and these are just the macros at the top level. We're now going to actually fix up the contents of those macros. And to do that, you would like to extract the Macro XML using some kind of an API call, but it doesn't exist as far as I know. So what I'm doing is I'm actually writing using the trusted application.save as text. I'm just writing that object to a text file so that I can then process it and read it back in. So save the macro to a text file in my temp folder, process it, and load it back in. And it will then have the new fixed up syntax. And of course, we're logging that again. So if we step in here, you can see what that macro, it was actually kind of interesting, what that macro looks like. This is an example from Northwind. And what we see is that there's a couple of lines with general information that we can skip. There's nothing there for us to fix up. And then we get begin end sections. We recognize that as lines of the macro. And the macro has actions, arguments, possibly a condition. For example, here's a condition. If it's not current project is trusted, then let's open form. So this is DoCmd open form. And as we know, DoCmd open form takes 6 arguments. These are the 6 arguments in the natural order. So that is what macros look like. And so if this is the name of a form that we've just taken the space out of, we now need to fix up that form name. Here's another one, login space dialog. There's also a etc. They don't make it really easy for you because they also do things like we're just going to break things up after 80 characters. So we are here at search BO, and then the X is on the next line and the closing bracket. So this is the continuation. Why they left it at 8? I mean, in the 21st century, I don't know, but that is what they're doing. So when you process this, you have to be cognizant of that can happen. The same thing with the argument. Argument can be pretty long, and it can wrap potentially more than one line because it is, I believe, an 80 character limit. So, and then also what I found out was this is a file that has Unicode encoding, so you cannot actually use standard file IO. You have to use scripting.file system object. So in addition to the 5 modules that I mentioned that I added, I also added the reference to the scripting DLL. Then this section you could see as a little bit of a database, quote unquote, of metadata about DoCmd methods, DoCmd close, DoCmd open form. And what I chose to do, what Access does is it gets that information in, as you know, from the object browser. It does that by browsing the TLB file, the type library. I looked at that a little bit because it would be so elegant if I could read the type library and find DoCmd open form and then see that it has 6 arguments, that kind of stuff. Get all that information like the object browser does, but unfortunately I was not able to do that, so I'm kind of doing a poor man's version of it. So I'm saying that open form, and these are then 6 characters for the 6 arguments, and the T, the 0, and the S tell me what to do with each of the arguments. So a T means to convention, because I know that DoCmd open form, the first argument is the name of a form, so we need to take out spaces. The 4th argument is the where clause, the where condition argument. And for that one, we're going to call S the SQL to convention one that can handle SQL statements. And the other 4 are I don't care. So those are zeros. DoCmd close is another one that takes 3 arguments, and only the 2nd one is of interest to me. And I need to do a to convention on that. So these are the 7, 8 items that occur in Northwind. Of course, in another application, you may need to add to this and say, we don't just have open form, but we also have, well, open report is here, but and any other DoCmd that was used in that application should have an entry here following the same little naming convention. So once we have that, we can then cycle over the content of that somewhat complex document, and at some point in time we get to the meat of it. Yes, here. So we recognize that we had that begin statement and that end part of the block and the action part of the block, and so for each of these we're going to do certain things, either getting some information or in some cases then also calling those conversion functions again to take out spaces. And now of course we write it all back to the output file, right line, we close the output file, and we are done returning the file. So that was a fair amount of work, kind of fun to do. And as I was working this, it was very interesting that in some cases, name autocorrect was very helpful. And one of them was actually with regards to the queries. If you open the query in design view, then name autocorrect will fix up a few things about it, like the table names. It recognizes that the table names have changed, and it will then actually apply that as soon as you open the query in design view. And we still have to do a little bit more work. So in this section, we're now here. We are actually going to look at the query text again, and we're going to call our SQL to convention to take out spaces.
Hey, Tom.
Yes, sir.
I noticed your variable was str object names at the top of each for loop, but that's not actually not a string, is it? That's a record. Is that a record set?
This is an array of strings. So get objects.
It returns array of strings. Okay.
It returns a string array. Yeah.
So I missed that. Okay, thanks.
No problem. And at this point, the queries have already been renamed. So this is actually slightly superfluous. It is more to stay within the same pattern. I could just have iterated over the query defs collection because, again, the queries have already been renamed. But it's kind of nice to just call get objects again. Module to convention, that gets interesting because now we are actually having to deal with VBA. So we have a module and we have to go into the module and look at, we can skip the declaration lines that are at the top of the module, and then we're getting into the functions, and we need to process those. And for the most part, I believe the guts of it is here in fixed code. Let's take a look at that. So this gives us a line. We're passing in a line or a multi-line of VBA. Now, I don't have a VBA parser, right? I'm just doing string parsing as good as I can. Writing a VBA parser would be outside of my abilities. And lucky me, I chose Northwind, and so I can remain focused on what is needed to do this for Northwind, not necessarily for your monster application that you've worked on for 20 years. So what I noticed was I could fix things up by looking at two kinds of syntax. One of them is the DoCmd open form and its cousins. If I can recognize that, then I can go fix up for example, the form name. It is there, just like I did with the macros. And then the other one is functions. So functions such as this one that is in Northwind, or just a simple d-first as is defined in VBA. Those are all functions that have open parentheses and arguments, 0 or more, and close parentheses. And so I can recognize those and then work with converting those functions. You have to be careful about nested parentheses. So a function like find closing parentheses is going to be careful about that. But if you have nested parentheses, that it will still do the right thing and find the correct closing parentheses for that closes the function call. We then tokenize the function, so we break it apart and go fix it up, basically. And the way we do that is, so here is where we actually use the log table. We say if I find a word here, especially starting at the long words, because I'm doing order by the length. So if I find a word that is, let's say, 3 words with 2 spaces in between, I'm going to look in the log table and see if I have such a name. And if I do, then I'm going to see what did I convert it to, and use that and plug it in here. That's essentially what this replace statement does. So I'm stepping into the log table, finding the best match for this string that I encountered, and replacing it. So if you've been paying real close attention, then you've probably realized that I'm doing things two different ways. In the macros, I had that little language of myself where I said, what was it, an S, a 0, or a T for each of the arguments. And that worked actually pretty well. This was the original code. This also works, but we are doing it two different ways. And if I had to refactor this, I might go the other way and say, for each function, you kind of need to define what the syntax is so that we can then reuse some of the code that I was using in the macro world to fix these guys up the same way. On the other hand, you know, this is just a weekend project, so I can do what I like. Try some different things, see what works best. At the end of the day, we end up with a line of VBA that had some of these functions in it potentially, and they have now been fixed up by taking out spaces. We then return that function back to its caller, that line of code. And we just loop around and we say, okay, let's delete the lines that were the old lines and let's insert the new stuff that we just created. And you just look forward in the module. Let's see what I want to show you next. I'm also looking at the clock. We still have a little bit of time. At some point, okay, right. So as you probably know, in Northwind, there are some VBA procedures, but there's also a fair amount of macros, embedded macros. And so here is where we are starting to look into that. We are at where we have just opened a form and we're looking over the forms properties collections. Controls also have embedded macros. We'll get there in a minute. But at this point, we're just at the form level. So we may have a form load that is a macro. And so if it is a macro, then let's call macro property to convention. And in that function, I'm writing out that macro to a file and processing it using the same code I already showed you. And we're returning that to the caller. So that's how we do the form level macros. And with controls, we're doing something similar. We step in here for a moment. So now we're looping over all the controls on the form. And we're going to look at some of the properties that are of interest to us. The name property of the control, because the control name may be first space name. We're now going to fix that up by calling to convention. This is also where that invoice report failed. It's in this section. This is for forms, but there's a similar section for reports, where there was a second control that was now going to be named customer name, and that's not allowed. So here we just assign the new name property. We log that name, and we do the same thing for other data aware properties. I realize that I'm probably not 100% inclusive of everything that can happen, but certainly I'm dealing with control source, I'm dealing with row source. They all kind of follow the same pattern, although there are some interesting little things going on that I don't have time for today. Source object, you know, the source object can be a subform, is often a subform. That subform had spaces in the past, so we need to go fix that up. Link master fields, link child fields. Those are all within the source object section because they kind of go together. List items edit form, you know about that one. Default value. default value can be some kind of a code expression, so we have to call fixed code. I know one of the ones that I probably forgot is order by and filter. They would follow exactly the same patterns as what is shown here. In this section, we're looping over the properties of the control. And we're looking for macros, for embedded macros. And if we find them, we do something very similar to what I already showed. Saving it out to a text, fixing it up, bringing it back in. If we have an event procedure, then we have to fix up that event procedure because of the embedded spaces. What is it? Customer underscore ID lost focus, right? That will now become customer ID lost focus. And so this event procedure convention does some of that work. So that gets us here. The controls have now been fixed up. This is also a good time to put the labels back because of that access being a little bit overly helpful. And then we also have to step into the code behind for the forms and fix it up the exact same way as standard modules. And that essentially gets you to the end of the forms, and then the reports are essentially the same, just that reports have a few things that forms don't have. The most interesting one is coming up here, grouping levels. And this one's actually stumped me for a little bit. The question is, how many grouping levels does this report have so that I can call for I equals 0 to grouping levels count -1? Well, I couldn't find it. I don't think that exists. But what I do know is that the grouping levels start at index 0. And so what I'm doing is, let's hope that there's not more than 99. And then as soon as I take an error, then I know that that grouping level, we're now at, let's say, grouping level 3, that didn't exist, then we can exit. So this is, I believe, an imperfection in the access object model, that it should have exposed a group level count somehow, maybe a group level collection that has a count. So otherwise, as I said before, reports follow the same pattern where the controls need to be fixed up, the code behind needs to be fixed up. That's all reusable code. And then we turn our options off again, and we are done. Debug that time. Done. So basically, that is what I wanted to show you today. And that gives us the new application as I just demoed it to you. To the innocent user, it looks exactly the same as before. But when we look at things like, for example, the relationships diagram, and we look at the orders table, you see how all the spaces have been taken out. It really looks a lot nicer. There's underscores where there used to be slashes. All right.
Thank you, Tom. That was fascinating. So now I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions. You can unmute yourself. You can type in the chat. We did not have questions during your presentation, so we're starting with a clean slate as far as questions go.
All right.
You can turn on your video now if you want. So question about how about validation and or conditional formatting?
Okay. Validation. So There is validation at the table level where you can have an expression, a validation rule.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
Yep. And I believe I didn't really touch on it, but I do have, yes,
Ah,
I stepped over it, but because it was also somewhat simple. So we are looking over all the tables. And then we're setting the validation rule equal to our converted validation rule. So if the rule was something like square bracket first space name square bracket is greater than A,
yep.
something silly like that, then it would now be the spaces would be taken out.
Very good.
So that's how I fix them up. Validation that is part of, let's say, a before update event that would of course be handled using the by fixing up the modules.
Yep. And conditional formatting.
Conditional formatting, and I think I may have forgotten about that because I don't think I have anything about conditional. No.
I mean, it's just it's amazing, you know, what you've done. I really am impressed with how you, when you push it out to XML or whatever, and you read it and you have the properties that you're ignoring and how you're handling each of those properties. And so it's kind of like you have to assume that all of the properties are exported for every one. So yeah, that the way you handle that, you know, if it was the SQL conversion or, you know, whatever, was kind of cool. I like that.
Thank you. Yeah, this was fun. I hesitated, you know, but you know, once you go down the road of I want to fix this up, you know, you can't really say, well, I don't use macros, so I'm not going to fix up these darn macros, because Northwind doesn't run without you fixing it up. You know, it doesn't even start because the first thing it looks for is login space form.
Yeah.
You know, and that's no longer there. By the way, this one also needed to be fixed up. File options, I got a tip from one of my MVP clients. Oh, this one doesn't have a display form, but if it did, it would be fixed up. Because this would also say login space form. And there is a way to fix that up using, I believe, safe setting. I'm a little fuzzy on that, but there is a way to do that. And it's in the code.
And I don't think you just asked this, but have you had any issues with the VBA event not rehooking? I think it's supposed to say, it says rebooking, but rehooking up with a renamed control.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. The code of an event procedure can get disconnected, quote unquote, from the event procedure itself. The design of the form is showing the ... You know, there is an event procedure there, yet it doesn't execute. It doesn't hit your breakpoint. It got disconnected. That usually happens with cut and paste. And it did not happen for me here. That would have been a major drag if it had, because I don't know of a good way to programmatically reassociate them. It's not out of the question that there is a way, but I can't immediately think of it.
So in my experience, I have that happening a lot less than I used to have. I'm wondering if the compiler is a little better, like if they corrected that at one point, but that would be a good thing to ask the Access team, you know, if there's a certain version where that's no longer an issue, or if it's just hit and miss, like, you know, we've experienced in the past.
Yep, I was concerned that when I renamed an event procedure, such as the example that I gave you, customer_ID.lostFocus, if I change the name of that event procedure to customer_ID.lostFocus or _lostFocus, if that would indeed cause that disassociation, but fortunately it didn't. So lucky me.
So one question I had, Tom, was, and I may have missed it in the entire presentation, but my impression from this is that if I wanted to take these, 5 modules that you did in Northwind
Yeah.
and copy them into another database that I've done, I could do so, but there would be a couple areas that I would need to handhold and tweak. Is that a correct impression? And if so, could you point out more specifically where those are for us?
Yes, excellent question. I did copy paste it into another Access sample application, and it ran without any errors. And I was actually somewhat surprised and happily surprised. But if you were to copy this into a real application of some consequence, you would have to do some additional work. And we're actually looking at one of them here. So as we are processing the macro file in this case, I know of some actions that can happen. This is an action. And that action takes 4 arguments. And I use that information to build up this array. But as you can see, these are all DoCmd actions. But we know from the documentation that there are probably 50, 75 DoCmd actions. So if those occurred in your real application, you would want to add to this array. Make it TA8 and add another line for your next action, and then look at what arguments it takes. And if it is something like a form object or so, then you want to call toConvention to take out spaces. And if it is more of a Sql statement kind of thing, then you want to call this one, so put an S there, and then it would just work. But yes, you would have to do that. So that's like building up the catalog further so that and it's a one-time investment that you can then of course reuse with other applications again. But you would have to do that. So this is clearly one of those areas. And then if we search for open form, we will find at least one more. Yes. So this is where we were in a line of VBA, a multi-line of VBA, and we were trying to fix up occurrences that are in Northwind, and these are the only 2 that are of this kind of signature. And so I wrote this code to do that. But if there were more VBA statements, such as DoCmd close, for example, this code doesn't know how to deal with that. DoCmd close, AC form, login, space form, that would then still fail, and so you would then have to add to this. And I mentioned in the presentation that I should probably refactor this, and rather than doing things 2 different ways, do this section the same way as I did with macros, where I should be able to understand that it's we had 8 there, one of the 8 DoCmd calls, and that this one happens to take 6 arguments. Let's pick them apart and let's fix up argument number 2 and argument number 4. So that's what I should probably do. The same thing here, where we were looking at the array of functions that happen in this application. This is a very small set. And so you would have to considerably build upon that for a real world application. Those are the areas that immediately come to mind. Most everything else, I think, will work. But it's fairly significant. If for a real application, this could be a couple of days of work. But in some situations, that may actually be worth it.
Yeah, but I know I'm sure a lot of other folks on this call as well have inherited applications with absolutely horrendous naming
Horrendous.
conventions that then cause you all kind of difficulties. And, you know, I mean, a cleanup is dangerous as well. It obviously has to be thoroughly tested afterwards. But this type of a tool would be a great tool to do that kind of a cleanup on.
And people have done that. For example, George has done Northwind manually. He actually sent me a copy of it. And although that's a valiant effort, it's of course, it's going to cost you that amount of time every time you do it. And so that's why I thought it would be fun to try to do it using code and see how far I could get. I have no doubt that I can add code for conditional formatting. You saw the compile errors where there were references to customer_ID. That one I probably have to walk around the block a few times, see if I can come up with a strategy that fixes up those, but leaves other similar ones alone. That's usually the hard part. But even if you get to 97% and have to do some manual cleanup after that, that's not so bad.
I would agree. So thank you so much, Tom. If anybody has more questions, feel free to voice them. Wait a minute. I don't think. Nope, I don't see any other ones. I have a couple comments about very detailed. Thank you so much for sharing. Very impressive and out of the box thinking on this. I did want to mention that Access Lunchtime, which is normally the last Tuesday of each month at 12 p.m. Central Time, is taking a summer break for the months of June and July. So we're returning on what is actually August 31st, the very last day of August. Technically, the summer is kind of done by then. So I don't have an actual topic aligned. I'm talking to a speaker from Europe about a selection of topics, and we're trying to pick one. So, but that will, I think by the time we get this video together and posted on YouTube, we'll have our topic picked for that. And then we're looking for other topics for the fall. So if you have something specific that you would like to see, feel free to mention it or drop it in the chat, and we'll see what we can do to get it lined up. Or if you want to present, we have a lot of programmers here. I'm happy to have you, as long as it's not something we've done, you know, in the last year or so.
Right. Well, thank you, Maria. This was fun.
You are very welcome. Thank you for sharing.
All right.
Thank you. I'm going to drop